His eyebrows lifted slightly, surprised that she was challenging him. It says, husbands should love their wives as Christ loved the church. It says, a man who finds a wife finds a good thing. But tell me, David, do you love me? The morning sun filtered through the curtains of the large duplex in Lekki, Lagos, casting golden streaks across the bedroom. Rachel sat at the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the floor. The loud tick of the wall clock reminded her that it was Sunday, the day when her husband, Pastor David, transformed into the man everyone adored. But before that transformation, there was always a storm. A sharp voice echoed through the house. Rachel, if you're not out here in 2 seconds, I am leaving you. She inhaled deeply, shutting her eyes for a brief moment. How did she get here? How did the man she once admired become so cold, so unkind? Rachel used to believe in love, patience, and the beauty of marriage. But after 5 years of being married to David, she felt more like a servant than a wife. She glanced at herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked back with tired eyes and a forced smile. She didn't recognize this woman anymore. This wasn't the life she had dreamed of. The booming voice came again, this time sharper. Rachel, patience is a virtue, but punctuality is obedience. You will not stand between me and my God. Rachel sighed, grabbed her handbag, and walked out of the room. As she descended the stairs, she saw David standing by the door, impatiently tapping his foot. His dark eyes scanned her from head to toe, his expression unreadable. Finally, you're always wasting time. She wanted to respond. She reminded him she was only 5 minutes late. But what was the point? David always had to be right. She followed him to the car, got into the passenger seat, and fastened her seatbelt. The moment he turned the ignition, the silence between them thickened. As the car pulled onto the main road, Rachel turned to steal a glance at David. His face was hard, focused on the road as if she weren't sitting beside him. She sighed and looked out of the window. Lekki was alive with activity. People walked to bus stops, some rushing to work, others heading to church. She envied them, the ones who looked genuinely happy. David had not touched her in months, not a kiss, not a warm embrace. At night, she simply faced the wall and muted prayers until he drifted off. And in the morning, he left the house without saying goodbye. There was no affection, no love, only church obligations and complaints after her supposed weakness. Rachel traced invisible patterns on her lap, lost in thought. When did her marriage become a prison? She still remembered the man she fell in love with. Back then, David had been kind, patient, and full of dreams. He would hold her hand in public, tell her how blessed he was to have her, and pray for her at night. But those days were gone. Now, he only saw her as a burden. Rachel was once excited to be a pastor's wife. She had imagined a marriage filled with partnership, mutual respect, and spiritual growth. But in reality, her role felt more like an obligation than a blessing. Church members expected her to be the perfect woman, calm, gentle, always smiling, and always serving. But how could she smile when she was breaking inside? She had tried talking to David about how she felt, but every time she did, he would throw scriptures at her. Wives, submit to your husband as unto the Lord. The husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. A wise woman built her home, but the foolish one tears it down. Rachel had memorized those verses not because she wanted to, but because David used them like weapons against her. She once asked him, "What about the verse that says, 'Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church'?" He had laughed and replied, "Love is obedience, Rachel. The greatest love you can give me is to obey." He had never brought up the conversation again. The car stopped at a red light. David drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, his face still tight with irritation. Rachel hated Sunday mornings, not because she did not love God, but because she had to pretend. Pretend that her marriage was perfect, pretend that she was happy, pretend that Pastor David was a good husband. She turned to him again. He looked like a perfect man, well dressed in his navy blue suit, his Bible neatly placed beside him, his posture confident. No one would ever believe that this same man could be so cold behind closed doors. She wondered if he ever felt guilty for how he treated her. Probably not. The car finally pulled into Living Waters Ministry, the large church David had built from scratch. The moment they arrived, he transformed. His frown disappeared. His posture became more relaxed. He reached for his Bible, stepping out of the car like a king greeting his people. Rachel took a deep breath before following him. Another Sunday, another day of pretending. She muttered. As they walked toward the entrance, Rachel heard familiar voices. "Good morning, Pastor. Good morning, Ma." People greeted them with admiration. Church members rushed to shake David's hand, praising him, asking for prayers. Rachel stood beside him, smiling politely, nodding at compliments. But deep down, she felt like a ghost. She watched as David laughed with the deacons, spoke warmly to church members, and exchanged pleasantries. It was almost comical. She wanted to shake them and say, "This man you admire, do you know who he really is?" But of course, she couldn't. She had to play her role, her fake suffocating role. She suddenly felt suffocated, like the church walls were closing in. She needed air. Rachel wasn't sure how much longer she could live like this. The air inside the Living Waters Ministry was electric with energy. Church members greeted one another warmly, voices overlapping in waves of chatter and laughter. Rachel sat quietly in front row, hands folded in her lap, her posture straight but tense. She had done this every Sunday for the past 5 years. She knew exactly how the day would unfold. First, there would be worship, then the sermon, then endless pleasantries with the congregation before she and David returned home, where he would revert to his true self. As the choir began singing, David leaned towards her and whispered, "Smile, smile." Rachel glanced at him. Expression unreadable. Smile? What was there to smile about? Still, she obeyed. A soft, empty curve appeared on her lips. It was what was expected of her, the supportive pastor's wife, who radiated warmth and devotion. The choir's voices swelled, the sound filling the massive hall. The congregation clapped, some waving their hands in worship. From an outsider's perspective, it looked like a perfect Sunday morning, but Rachel felt nothing. When it was time for David to preach, he rose from his seat with practiced grace. The moment he stepped onto the pulpit, the congregation erupted in applause. Rachel watched as he transformed before her eyes. Gone was the impatient, condescending man who had rushed her out of the house that morning. In his place stood Pastor David Adeyemi, the respected preacher, the man beloved by thousands, the man who knew how to captivate a room with just his voice. "Praise the Lord! Hallelujah!" The congregation responded in unison. If If you are grateful to be alive, shout the loudest amen. Amen! David smiled as he opened his Bible, his voice ringing with authority and warmth. Today, my brethren, we are going to talk about patience. Rachel's fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. Patience. The irony was almost unbearable. The same man who had barely given her time to get ready for church, who had mocked her and belittled her for being a few minutes late, was now standing on the pulpit preaching about patience. Rachel lowered her gaze to her lap, biting the inside of her cheek. David continued, his tone gentle yet firm. Many of us categorize sin. We say, oh, lying is a small sin, but adultery is a big sin. But let me tell you today, sin is sin. The congregation murmured in agreement. A little impatience is a little anger. These things may seem minor, but they separate us from God. Rachel almost laughed. David spoke with so much conviction, as though he practiced the very virtues he preached, as if he wasn't the same man who snapped at her over the smallest things, who dismissed her feelings, who made her feel invisible. As David's sermon continued, Rachel glanced around the auditorium. The church was packed. Women sat at the front, hanging onto his every word, nodding along, eyes wide with admiration. Some even took notes, as if his words were directly from heaven. Men clapped and cheered. Youth members leaned forward, eager to absorb his wisdom. No one saw what she saw. To them, David was a leader, a spiritual father, a role model. To her, he was a stranger. Rachel had stopped trying to convince herself that her husband would change. She had given up on the dream of a happy marriage. All she did now was endure. The worst part was that nobody would believe her if she spoke out. Who would dare ask questions about Pastor David, the man who prayed for the sick and fed the poor, the man whose congregation adored him? Rachel exhaled softly. There was no escape. After an hour of preaching, David ended his sermon with a prayer. The congregation rose to their feet, clapping as he stepped down from the pulpit. Church members rushed forward, eager to shake his hand, to receive a blessing, to be noticed. Rachel stood awkwardly at the side, watching the scene unfold. She was used to this. The moment David stepped off the pulpit, he was surrounded by people, deacons, ushers, elders, all of them fighting for a moment of his time. And he loved it. He smiled warmly, his deep voice carrying over the chatter. He asked about people's families, their businesses, their prayer requests. To them, he was approachable, kind, and attentive. To Rachel, he was a ghost. He didn't look in her direction, didn't acknowledge her presence. She might as well have been invincible. Rachel stood there for several minutes waiting, wanting for him to notice her. But he didn't. She watched as he spoke with an elderly woman, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She saw him laugh with one of the deacons, his teeth flashing in the bright church lights. The same hands that hadn't touched her in months, the same voice that had never spoken gently to her at home. Rachel swallowed the lump in her throat. It was like she didn't exist. Eventually, she gave up. She turned away and walked out of the auditorium. She didn't want to pretend anymore. As she stepped outside, the Lagos sun was blinding. The chatter from church members surrounded her, but she barely heard it. For the first time, she let a dangerous thought enter her mind. What if she left? Not forever, just for a while. Just long enough to remember what it felt like to be a person again. Just long enough to breathe. She exhaled shakily. No, she couldn't think like that. The drive home from church was silent. Rachel sat in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She didn't bother trying to start a conversation. What was the point? David wasn't the type of man to entertain discussions that didn't revolve around him or his ministry. She sighed quietly. The day had played out exactly as she expected. David had preached about love, patience, and kindness. And then, the moment service ended, he had completely ignored her. The only time he acknowledged her was when they were leaving the church. And even then, it was a simple let go, no warmth, no eye contact. Rachel had spent years pretending not to care. She had swallowed her heart, forced herself to believe that if she prayed hard enough, David would change. But today, something inside her had shifted. For the first time, she didn't feel hot. She felt numb. The moment they arrived home, David removed his jacket, placed his Bible on the table, and headed straight for the bedroom without saying a word. Rachel lingered in the living room for a moment before making her way to the kitchen. Cooking had once been something she enjoyed. She loved the smell of fresh vegetables, the sound of sizzling onions, the feeling of creating something that brought warmth to others. But in this house, even food had lost its joy. She knew David wouldn't say thank you. He never did. She chopped the vegetables, fried the chicken, and prepared the jollof rice, hoping that maybe, just maybe, tonight would be different. Rachel set the table, placing a bowl of steaming rice and a plate of grilled chicken in front of David's usual seat. She took her own seat and waited. Moments later, he entered the dining area, glanced at the food, and sat down. Rachel watched him, hoping for a sign of appreciation, but he simply picked up the fork, prodded the rice half-heartedly, then pushed the plate away. "I'm not hungry," he muttered. Rachel stared at him, disbelief washing over her. "You haven't eaten all day," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. David leaned back in his chair, arms folded. "I said, I am not hungry." Her fingers tightened around her spoon. So, this was how the night was going to go? She had seen this pattern many times before. The passive-aggressive silence, the refusal to engage, the unspoken punishment. And for what? Because she hadn't clung to his side after church. Because she had walked away first. Rachel exhaled slowly. She had once pleaded with him, tried to understand his moods, tried to fix things even when she wasn't at fault. But not today. "David," she said, her voice steady, "you are upset. I can see that. But punishing me with silence and refusing to eat isn't going to change anything." David's eyes darkened. "Punishing you?" He scoffed. "So now I can't decide when I want to eat without it becoming an issue?" Rachel held his gaze. She wasn't going to back down. "You've been cold all day," she said. "You ignored me after service. You didn't even look at me until we got to the car." David sighed dramatically, rubbing his temple. "Rachel, not everything is about you. Maybe I just wasn't in the mood to talk." She clenched her jaw. "Then why are you making it a point to ignore this food?" David smiled, shaking his head. "Here we go. Proverb 21:20, he said, leaning forward. "A foolish woman wastes food. If I'm not hungry, forcing me to eat is just wasteful. The Bible says so." Rachel felt her chest tighten. She should have known. He always did this. Anytime she tried to hold him accountable, he would turn to scripture, twisting verses to justify his actions. She gripped the edge of the table, struggling to contain her frustration. "Do you know what else the Bible says, David?" she asked, her voice firm. His eyebrows lifted slightly, surprised that she was challenging him. "It says, husbands should love their wives as Christ loved the church. It says, a man who finds a wife finds a good thing. But tell me, David, do you love me? A long, tense silence. David didn't answer. Instead, he picked up his phone, scrolled through his messages, and pretended she wasn't sitting right in front of him. Rachel's heart sank. That was her answer. Without another word, she stood up. She took her plate, dumped the food inside the sink, and walked out of the dining room. David didn't call her back. He didn't even glance up. Rachel walked into the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the floor. What was she even fighting for anymore? She had given her all to the marriage. She had prayed, fasted, endured, forgiven, excused, and compromised. And for what? To feel like a guest in her own home? To live with a man who refused to see her? Rachel rubbed her forehead, trying to ease the dull ache forming at her temples. A few years ago, she would have been crying by now. She would have sat on this same bed, begging God for strength, asking Him to fix her marriage. But tonight, there were no tears, just exhaustion, and an overwhelming sense of finality. She was tired of trying, tired of begging for love, tired of pretending everything was fine. For the first time in years, Rachel followed herself to ask the questions that had been creeping at the back of her mind for far too long. What if she stopped trying altogether? The next morning, the soft glow of early morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a faint golden hues across the bedroom. Rachel turned in bed, her body aching from a restless night. She lifted her arm and winced. Her right wrist was swollen. The frustration from last night had pushed her to grip the dining table too hard, and now her body bore the evidence of her emotions. She sighed and sat up, staring at the wall ahead. David was already up, probably gone to the church or busy with his morning prayers. Not that it mattered. She didn't care, not today. Her eyes drifted toward her phone on the nightstand. She picked it up and unlocked the screen, scrolling through the old messages without any real purpose. That was when she saw it. A message from Nathan. Nathan had been her friend in the university, one of the few people who genuinely understand her. They had studied together, laughed over silly jokes, and dreamed of the future. But after graduation, life happened. She got married, became a pastor's wife, and somewhere along the line, she lost touch with everyone that mattered. She opened the message. It was from 2 weeks ago. Rachel, I don't know if this number still works, but I just want to check on you. Hope you are doing well. It's been too long. Rachel stared at the screen, hesitating. For years, she had ignored people from her past, too consumed with the weight of her marriage to maintain friendships. But today, she wasn't thinking about being a pastor's wife. Today, she was just a woman trying to remember who she used to be. Without overthinking, she typed a response. Nathan, wow, it really has been too long. I hope you're good too. Within minutes, her phone vibrated. Rachel, you have no idea how happy I am to see this reply. How have you been? She hesitated before responding. The truth was, she wasn't sure how she had been. I'm managing, Rachel replied. Nathan's reply came almost instantly. That doesn't sound good. Want to catch up over lunch? My treat. Rachel froze. Lunch? It felt so normal. For the past few years, her life had revolved around church meetings, obligations, and trying to keep her home together. But when was the last time she did something for herself? She stared at the message for a long moment before typing her reply. Sure, when and where? By 1 p.m., Rachel found herself seated in a cozy restaurant in Victoria Island. The place was modern and stylish, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the busy streets. She hadn't been to a place like this in years. She had forgotten what it felt like to be outside her role as a pastor's wife. As she waited, she noticed people around her, friends laughing over lunch, couples enjoying quiet conversation, business people having meetings. This was a different world, a world where people weren't judged by their obedience or submission, but by how they felt and what they wanted. She suddenly felt out of place. Was she doing something wrong by being here? Before she could dwell on the thought, a familiar voice interrupted her. Rachel! She looked up, and there he was, Nathan. Nathan hadn't changed much. Tall, confident, with an easy smile. His presence was warm, familiar, a reminder of a time when life was simple. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. Wow! I can't believe I'm actually seeing you in person after all these years. Rachel smiled, and for the first time in a while, it wasn't forced. I know, she said. It's been forever. Nathan studied her for a moment before speaking. You look different. Rachel's smile faltered slightly. Different. She knew what he meant. She wasn't the same Rachel he used to know. Marriage changes people, she said lightly, avoiding his gaze. Nathan nodded, but didn't press further. Instead, he waved over a waiter, and they placed their orders. So tell me, how has life been? Rachel asked, shifting the attention to him. Nathan laughed. Life has been something else. Work keeps me busy, but I've been good. What about you? How is your life? Rachel hesitated. Should I tell him the truth? Should she say that she felt trapped, that she no longer recognized the person she had become? Instead, she gave a neutral response. It's been steady, in fact. Nathan chuckled. That sounds like a safe answer. Rachel shook her head, laughing softly. Maybe. The conversation flowed easily. They talked about old memories, about mutual friends, about how life had unfolded in ways they never expected. For the first time in a long time, Rachel felt like herself. She laughed freely. Not the polite, calculated laugh she used at church gatherings, but a real, genuine laugh. It felt foreign, yet refreshing. Nathan noticed. I remember when you used to laugh like that all the time, he said, smiling. You were always so full of life. Rachel's smile faded slightly. Was she really that different now? She wanted to say, I had to change. Instead, she took a sip of her drink and said nothing. As the lunch went on, Rachel began to realize just how much of herself she had lost. Nathan talked about his travels, his career, the people he had met. He spoke about life with excitement. And Rachel, her life had shrunk. She had dedicated herself entirely to a marriage that left her feeling empty. At some point, she had stopped dreaming. She had stopped living. And as she sat across from someone who still saw her as the Rachel she used to be, a small part of her wondered if she could ever find that person again. After lunch, Nathan walked her to her car. I'm really glad we did this, he said. Rachel nodded. Me too. Nathan hesitated before speaking again. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm always here. Rachel smiled, but she didn't answer. She got into her car and watched as Nathan walked away. For a brief moment, she felt lighter. Then reality settled back in. She had to go home, back to David, back to her empty marriage. But as she started the engine, one thought refused to leave her mind. Did she have to live like this forever? The moment Rachel stepped into the house that evening, she felt it. The tension, the anger, the storm waiting to explode. David was home. She shut the door behind her and turned around. He was standing in the middle of the living room, arms crossed, his face set in a deep frown. His eyes burned with suspicion as they locked onto hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Rachel knew this was coming. She exhaled slowly, preparing herself. She would not back down, not today. Where were you? David's voice was cold and sharp. Rachel stayed calm. Out. David took a step closer, his hand clenched into fist at his side. Out where? Rachel placed her handbag on the couch, refusing to let him intimidate her. I had lunch. With who? Silence. David took another step, his jaw tightening. With him. Rachel finally met his eyes. Yes. The word hung in the air like a spark in dry grass. David's nostrils flared, his lip twisted into a bitter snare. So it's true. You went to see Nathan. Rachel folded her arms. I did. You had the audacity to sit in a restaurant with another man behind my back? Rachel laughed bitterly. Oh, now you care. Now you suddenly have an interest in where I go and who I see? David's face darkened. I am your husband. You owe me respect. Rachel's patience snapped. Respect? She repeated, her voice rising. David, when was the last time you respected me? When was the last time you even saw me as a person, not just an extension of yourself? David shook his head, his anger bubbling to the surface. Don't twist this, Rachel. I am the man of this house. I am the head, and you are the wife. You do not have the right to go out and meet with another man behind my back. Rachel stepped forward, refusing to cower. You are the head of this house? Really? A real leader listens, David. A real leader loves. You do neither. David's breath hitched. He had expected her to be defensive, apologetic, or fearful. But she wasn't afraid. She was challenging him. This was not the Rachel he controlled. David's anger boiled over. His voice thundered through the house. I am your husband, Rachel. You owe me your obedience. Rachel's eyes flashed with fury. Obedience? Is that what marriage means to you? That I should sit quietly while you ignore me? That I should let you use the Bible as a weapon to justify treating me like I don't matter? David pointed a finger at her, his body trembling. You are my wife. You do not have the right to disobey me. Rachel laughed in disbelief. Do you hear yourself? You treat me like property, like I exist to serve you and nothing else. But guess what, David? She took a deep breath and stared him down. Nathan listens to me. Something you never do. David's entire body went rigid. His hands trembled. His chest rose and fell rapidly. Rachel had never spoken to him like this before. For years, she had walked on eggshells, careful not to push him too far. But not tonight. Tonight, she was done playing the submissive wife. David snapped. He grabbed a glass from the table and hurled it against the wall. The glass shattered into pieces, scattering across the floor. Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't scream or step backward. She just stood there, staring at him, unshaken. Her lack of fear unsettled him. For the first time, David realized he was losing control over her, and it terrified him. Rachel took a slow step forward. You can throw things, you can shout, but it won't change anything, David. David's fists clenched. You are my wife. You belong to me. Rachel tilted her head, eyes sharp. I am not a possession, David. I am a person, a woman, and I will no longer shrink myself just to fit into the image you want me to be. David's breathing was heavy. He didn't know what to do. For years, Rachel had been quiet, obedient, and careful. Now, she stood before him, strong, unyielding. He had spent years demanding submission, but in the process, he had lost something greater. He had lost his wife's heart. David turned away, running a hand over his face. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. That is fear. Fear that Rachel was slipping away. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could stop it. Rachel stood still, watching him. She saw the struggle in his eyes, but it was too late. She had spent too many years watching, hoping, waiting, praying for him to change. Now, she realized she didn't have to wait for him to change. She had to change herself. Rachel turned away, heading for the bedroom. She didn't slam the door. She didn't cry. She simply walked away because the fight was over. She had already won. The days after that explosive argument were different. Rachel felt it in the air, in the way she moved through the house, in the way she looked at David. Something inside her had shifted. She no longer tiptoed around him. She no longer waited for him to approve for anything that she wanted to do. She no longer feared him. For years, she had been careful with her words, careful with her actions, careful not to upset him. But now, that caution had vanished. Rachel had spent years begging for love. Now, she was done begging. David noticed the difference immediately. At first, he thought it was temporary. Maybe Rachel was just angry. Maybe after a few days, she would go back to normal, back to the woman who pleased him, obeyed him, and feared him. But as the days turned into weeks, he realized this was not a phase. Rachel was changing. She no longer awaited for him at the dining table during meals. She no longer tried to force conversation when he ignored her. She stopped explaining herself. One morning, David walked into the kitchen and saw Rachel humming softly as she made breakfast. It wasn't for him. She was making it for herself. She used to always wait for him to come to the table before she would eat. But now, she sat down, took her time, and ate peacefully, as though she were alone in the house. David watched her, his jaw tightening. This was not the Rachel he knew. Where was the woman who used to look at him with pleading eyes? The woman who used to beg for his attention? She was gone. At first, David tried to reassert his authority. So one evening, as Rachel was getting ready for bed, he stood by the door watching her. "I don't like the way you've been behaving," he said finally. Rachel didn't look at him. "That's not my problem," Rachel replied. David's finger twitched. "You are my wife." Rachel met his gaze in the mirror. "And you are my husband. But that never stopped you from treating me like I was invisible." David's chest tightened. She wasn't afraid anymore. That scared him. For years, his power had come from her fear. Now that it was gone, he didn't know how to control her. As Rachel became stronger, she found herself thinking more about Nathan. They had continued talking, not romantically, just as friends. Nathan was kind, attentive, warm. He checked on her, sent her encouraging messages, made her smile. One evening, as they sat across from each other at a small cafe, Nathan suddenly reached for her hand. "Rachel," he said, his voice soft but careful. She looked up, her heart pounding. "I need to tell you something." She swallowed. "Okay." Nathan hesitated before speaking again. "I have feelings for you." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She should have seen this coming. The way he looked at her, the way he treated her like she was someone special. She pulled her hand away, shaking her head. "Nathan, You don't have to say anything," he interrupted. "I just needed you to know." Rachel looked away, conflicted. Part of her wanted to run into his arms, to let herself feel the warmth she had been missing for years. But another part of her held back. She was still married. Even if her marriage was a prison, even if she no longer loved David, did that justify living? She didn't know. All she knew was that her heart was confused. That night, Rachel walked into the house with her mind spinning. David was sitting in the living room, his hands clasped together, his posture tense. She was about to walk past him when she heard his voice. Rachel. She stopped. There was something different about his tone. She turned around and saw something that shocked her to the core. David was on his knees. Her heart skipped a beat. David, kneeling? This was not the man she knew. He took a shaky breath, his voice breaking. I have failed as a husband. Rachel felt the air leave her lungs. David never apologized. Never. She waited, arms crossed, guided. Why are you saying this now? David looked up at her, his eyes heavy with something she had never seen before. That is guilt. I can feel it, Rachel, he whispered. I can feel you slipping away. Rachel's throat tightened. David never cared before, so why now? She watched as he lowered his head, exhaling deeply. I was blind, he admitted. I thought being a man meant controlling you, but I see now that I was very wrong. Rachel stood frozen, unsure of what to say. David swallowed hard. I took you for granted. I ignored you, dismissed your feelings, treated you like a servant instead of a wife. He stopped, his voice breaking. Rachel's chest ached. She had wanted this apology for years. She had prayed for this moment. And yet, she didn't feel relief. She didn't feel anything at all. Was it too late? Rachel looked down at David, searching for sincerity in his face. Was this real or just another tactic to pull her back in? A few weeks ago, she would have jumped at this chance, grabbed onto his words, let herself believe things would change. But now, she wasn't sure. Rachel took a deep breath. David, I need time. David's shoulders sagged, but he nodded. I understand. She turned away, heading for the bedroom, her heart heavy with uncertainty. Because for the first time, the decision was no longer David's, it was hers. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she still wanted this marriage. The house felt different. For years, it had been a place of tension, silence, and unspoken battles. But now, the air had shifted. David had changed, or at least he was trying to. Rachel watched him carefully over the next few weeks. Her heart torn between doubt and hope. She had heard apologies before, seen promises made and broken. But this time, something about David felt different. He no longer backed others. He no longer dismissed her feelings. He even started doing something he had never done before, listening to her. One evening, Rachel sat in the living room when David walked in with a book in his hand. She glanced at the cover and almost laughed in disbelief. Restoring Broken Marriages. David read a marriage book. He sat down across from her, clearing his throat. I've been reading a lot lately, he said carefully, about how to be a better husband. Rachel said nothing. He hesitated. I started counseling. Her eyes widened slightly. You did? David nodded. I talked to a pastor, that is Pastor Emmanuel. I told him everything. Rachel's heart tightened. For David to admit his fault to another pastor, to expose the cracks in his image, it was unbelievable. What did he say? She asked, testing him. David sighed. He told me something I never thought about before. That being the head of the house doesn't mean being a dictator. It means serving, loving, and I failed at that. Rachel looked at him, searching his face for signs of deception. But all she saw was a man who finally saw his own mistakes. Still, she wasn't ready to believe him. Not yet. A week later, Rachel sat in the church pews, stunned as David walked to the altar. The congregation fell silent. David took a deep breath, gripping the microphone. "There is something I need to say," he began, his voice steady. "For years, I have stood here and preached about love, patience, and kindness, but I have not practiced those things in my own home." Murmurs filled the room. Rachel's heart pounded. David continued, "I have wronged my wife. I have neglected her, hurt her, and treated her with selfishness instead of love. And today, I confess my sins before God and before all of you." Gasps echoed through the hall. Rachel felt her throat tighten. This was not the David she knew. The David she knew cared too much about his reputation to ever admit his fault in front of the church. Yet here he was, owning his mistakes. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt conflicted. Was this real change or just another performance? She wasn't sure. Over the next few days, David became someone different. He stopped criticizing her. He asked about her day. He even started doing things she never imagined, helping with chores, apologizing when he was wrong, sitting beside her instead of across from her. One evening, as she watched him clean up the dining table, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a flicker of warmth. A memory surfaced. The man she had fallen in love with was not a cruel man. He had once been kind, patient, and full of dreams. Had that man been buried under pride and control? Could he really change? Rachel wasn't sure, but for the first time in years, she was willing to wait and see. Just as she began to consider giving David a chance, Nathan called. "Rachel," he said, his voice soft, "can we meet?" She hesitated. "Nathan, I don't know if that's a good idea." "Please," he insisted, "I need to talk to you." Against her better judgment, she agreed. They met at the same restaurant where they had shared lunch weeks ago. Nathan looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "I meant it," he said finally, "when I said I have feelings for you." Rachel sighed. "Nathan." "Just hear me out," he interrupted. "I see you, Rachel. I see the woman you used to be before your marriage drained you, and I know you feel something for me too." Rachel stared at the table. Did she? Yes, she cared about Nathan. He made her feel heard, appreciated, and important. But could she really walk away from her marriage? Nathan reached across the table, taking her hand. "Come with me," he said. "Start over. Be happy. You don't have to stay in a marriage that suffocates you." Rachel's heart pounded. This was it. Her chance to leave, to escape the years of pain, to step into something new. But David was trying. For the first time, he was truly trying. Rachel pulled her hand back, tears welling in her eyes. "Nathan," she whispered, "I don't know." Nathan exhaled, shaking his head. "You don't have to decide now, but please think about it." That night, Rachel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. David had apologized. He had admitted his mistakes. He was making an effort. But was effort enough? She turned to look at the man beside her, the man who had once hurt her but was now trying to heal. Then she thought about Nathan, the man who offered her a fresh start. Rachel closed her eyes, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She had spent years being controlled. Now, for the first time, the choice was hers, and she had no idea what to do. Rachel sat in the back seat of a taxi, staring out the window as Lagos' busy streets blurred past her. Her heart was heavy. This was it, her last meeting with Nathan. For weeks, She had been torn between two paths, one leading to freedom and the unknown, the other leading back to her marriage, to the man who had broken her but was trying to rebuild. She didn't know if she was making the right choice, but she knew she had to make one. Nathan was already waiting when she arrived at the small cafe where they had met before. The moment she walked in, he stood up, his face lighting up, until he saw the look in her eyes. Rachel took a deep breath and sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the table and met his gaze. She had to be honest. Nathan, she began softly. See, I love my husband. Nathan's face fell. She could see the pain in his eyes, the way his fingers tightened around the edge of the table. But he swallowed, his voice cracking slightly. Rachel, does he love you? Rachel sighed. I don't know. Maybe not the way you do. But he is trying. And I owe it to myself, to our marriage, to at least try too. Nathan's jaw clenched. He looked down at his hands for a long moment before exhaling deeply. When he looked back up at her, his expression was soft, but pained. I don't want to lose you, he admitted. Rachel felt a lump in her throat. Neither did she. Nathan had been her light in the darkest times. He had shown her kindness, made her feel valued. But she wasn't ready to throw away her marriage. I know, she said, and I am sorry. I am so sorry. Nathan forced a sad smile. Don't be. You are doing what you think is right. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. You are a good man, Nathan. And one day, you'll find someone who will love you the way you deserve. Nathan gave a small broken laugh. I already did. Rachel felt tears tinge her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. This was the end. She had made her choice, and now it was time to go home. Rachel stood outside her home, staring at the door. This house had once felt like a prison, a place where she had felt unseen, unheard, unloved. Now, as she reached for the handle, it felt different. Not because the past had vanished, not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because she had changed. She wasn't the same woman who used to beg for love. She wasn't afraid anymore. She knew her worth. Rachel stepped inside. She walked into the living room and froze. David was on his knees. His hands clasped tightly together, his head bowed in prayer. He didn't hear her enter. His voice very low, raw, full of emotion. God, he whispered, I have been a terrible husband. I have failed my wife. I have hurt her. I have pushed her away. But I love her, Lord. And if you can please help me fix this. Rachel's breath hitched. David didn't know she was listening. This wasn't a performance. This wasn't about pride. This was a man begging God to restore what he had broken. She had spent so many years praying for him to change. And now, here he was, praying for her marriage. Tears welled in her eyes. She had made the right choice. David finally looked up and saw her. Their eyes met, and for the first time in years, there was no anger, no control, no fear, only raw emotion. Rachel took a deep breath. David, I'm here. He stood up slowly, searching her face. Does that mean? Rachel nodded. It means I'm willing to try. David's shoulders sagged with relief. Rachel, his voice broke. I swear to you, I will never take you for granted again. She studied him, her heart still cautious but hopeful. We take it one step at a time, she said firmly. No empty promises, No repeating the past. We start fresh. David nodded, his eyes shining with sincerity. I will prove myself to you, he vowed. Rachel gave a small smile. You don't have to prove anything with words, David. Just show me. David reached for her hand, but this time he didn't pull or demand. He simply held it gently and respectfully. And for the first time in a long time, Rachel felt at peace. Months had passed since Rachel made her decision to stay. So much had changed. David was no longer the man who backed others, who dismissed her feelings, who controlled her every move. He had become gentler, softer, more present. Rachel had expected the change to be temporary, a performance to keep her from leaving, but each day he proved her wrong. He listened, he apologized when he was wrong. He no longer treated their marriage like a battlefield, but rather as a partnership. And for the first time in years, Rachel felt safe. Mornings were different now. Instead of tension and silence, there was laughter and warmth. David would wake up and pray with her, something he had never done before. They talked about their dreams, their fears, their plans for the future. There were still moments when Rachel would hold back, afraid that the past would repeat itself. But every time doubt crept in, David would show her, through his actions, that he was committed to change. She had stopped waiting for perfection. Instead, she was learning to appreciate the effort. And slowly, the love she thought was dead began to bloom again. One beautiful morning, Rachel woke up feeling unusually tired. She ignored it at first, assuming it was just exhaustion from work. But as the days passed, she noticed other changes. The dizziness, the nausea, the strange cravings. A quiet realization crept into her mind. Could it be? She sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding. She needed to be sure. So later that afternoon, she went to the pharmacy and bought a pregnancy test. The moment she got home, she locked herself into the bathroom and took the test. She waited 1 minute, 2 minutes, then she saw it. 2 bold lines. Rachel's breath hitched. She was pregnant. Her hands trembled as she stared at the test. After all these years, after everything, God had given them a child. Tears rolled down her cheeks. This was more than just a pregnancy. It was a second chance. That evening, Rachel sat in the living room, waiting for David to return home. Her heart was pounding with nerves and excitement. When he finally walked in, he greeted her with a warm smile, something that had become normal these days. You're home early, he said, kissing her forehead. Rachel took a deep breath. David, I need to tell you something. David's face grew serious. What is it? She hesitated for a moment, then took his hand and placed it on her stomach. We are going to have a baby. For a few seconds, David just stared at her, his mouth slightly open. Then his expression crumbled with emotion. A baby? He whispered, as if he didn't believe it. Rachel nodded, tears forming in her eyes. David's face broke into a wide, disbelieving smile. Without warmth, he pulled her into his arms, hugging her so tightly she could barely breathe. Rachel, he whispered, his voice breaking. I don't deserve this. She pulled back, looking into his eyes. Yes, you do. David shook his head. After everything I put you through, after all the pain I caused you. Rachel held his face in her hands. God has given us another chance, David. Let's not waste it. David closed his eyes, overcome with emotion. I swear, he said, his voice thick with tears, I will never take you or our child for granted. I will love both of you with everything I have. Rachel smiled. For the first time in years, She believed him. That night, as they lay in bed, Rachel placed her hand on her stomach. David reached over and covered her hand with his. They lay there in silence, their hearts full. Their past was broken, but their future was bright. Rachel had once thought her marriage was beyond saving. She had once believed that love had died, but love had been buried, not lost. And now it had found its way back, with patience, with forgiveness, with faith. Rachel smiled to herself. Her journey hadn't been easy, but as she lay beside the man she once thought she had lost, carrying the life they had created together, she knew without a doubt she had made the right choice. And so, David's and Rachel's story came to a full circle as they lived happily ever after. The most important lesson from this story is that love, trust, and respect in marriage should never be taken for granted, because while people can change and relationships can be built, true healings only happens when both partners are willing to acknowledge their mistakes, make sincere efforts to grow, and choose each other every single day. And with that, my dear friends, our story comes to a close. But remember, the magic of storytelling lives on, waiting to whisk us away on new adventures, where the wonders of imagination know no bounds. Goodbye for now, and may your dreams be filled with joy, wonder, and endless possibility. Thank you so much for watching. Please kindly comment, like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting stories.